The family had always known that there was something odd about the barn. It stood at the edge of the property, its wood faded by time and its roof sagging just a little from years of rain and snow. From the outside, it looked just like any other barn, a place to store hay, feed, and the odd collection of tools. But everyone knew the rule. No one was allowed in the barn. It wasn't just that the barn was off limits. It was the way Grandpa acted whenever anyone even mentioned it. His face would tighten, his eyes would narrow, and the air would grow a little colder around him. The rule wasn't just a simple house rule. It felt like it carried a weight, something heavier than just protecting a space for storage. No one dared question him about it, and no one ever pushed the boundaries. The barn became more than just a building. It became a mystery, one that the grandchildren were desperate to solve but had no real way of doing so. Grandpa never explained why. He'd always find a way to change the subject whenever it came up. "That's for me to know," he'd say with a wink, his gruff voice filled with something the grandkids couldn't quite place. "And for you to never bother with." And just like that, the subject was dropped. No one dared to ask again. The barn wasn't huge, but it was big enough that its shadow stretched across the backyard in the late afternoon sun. It was an old barn, built when the farm was still a thriving place, a bustling home with livestock, fields of crops, and plenty of people running around. But over the years, the farm had slowed down. Grandpa had gotten older, and the barn had started to show its age. The roof leaked, the doors creaked loudly when pushed, and the walls, once strong and proud, had started to warp in places. Yet despite all that, Grandpa had always kept the barn in good condition. It was the one thing on the farm that he seemed to care about more than anything else. The grandchildren always wondered what lay inside. They'd play near it, kick a ball in the yard, or climb the trees that lined the property. But they never got too close to the barn. Even though they were older now, the rule still felt too sacred to break. And besides, what could be in there? Grandpa was a man who didn't believe in extravagance. He didn't own much, and the few things he had he kept in places that made sense. So why was the barn different? Why was it off limits? The grandkids spent a lot of time together, especially in the summer. The house had always been the gathering place for family events, barbecues, and holidays. Everyone came from all over to visit Grandpa. They'd sit at the long wooden table in the kitchen, where Grandma used to bake pies and cook hearty meals that smelled of fresh bread and herbs. There were always too many people in the house, so the grandkids often took their conversations outside, sitting under the wide green trees near the barn. They'd talk about school, their lives, and all the things that seemed so important when they were young, but the barn was never part of those talks. It was just there, a silent presence in the background, a reminder that there were things about Grandpa that no one dared ask about. It wasn't until Grandpa's sudden death that everything changed. It happened one cold winter morning. Grandpa had been out in the barn as usual, tending to whatever needed attention. The cold didn't seem to bother him much, even though he was getting older. He had a way of braving the weather that most people would find uncomfortable. But that morning, when the family went to check on him, they found him sitting in the old wooden chair near the fireplace, a peaceful look on his face. It was almost as if he'd just fallen asleep, his favorite worn-out sweater draped over his shoulders, a cup of tea half empty on the table beside him. The family gathered, shocked and grieving. It wasn't unexpected. Grandpa had been growing frail in the last few months, but it hit everyone hard. The house felt emptier without his booming laugh, his gruff voice, and his occasional stories that never seemed to get old. For the grandkids, it was like losing a part of their childhood, a connection to something constant in their lives. They stood around in the living room, holding hands and comforting each other, all of them still in disbelief. The funeral was a quiet affair. There were no long speeches, no grand displays of emotion. Grandpa had always been a private man, and the family respected that. He didn't want to fuss, so they kept things simple. But even after the service, after the last of the family had left, the barn still loomed there, just as it always had. It felt like a weight on everyone's chest. It was a symbol of something unknown, and now without Grandpa there to guard it, the curiosity that had always simmered beneath the surface finally began to bubble up. The grandkids found themselves returning to the farm in the weeks that followed. They hadn't planned to stay long, but somehow the pull of the old house was too strong to ignore. They'd talk about Grandpa, remembering his words and his quiet ways, but soon the conversation always turned back to the barn. What was inside? Why had Grandpa kept it locked away from everyone? Their parents had always dismissed it. It's just an old barn, they'd say. Nothing special. Don't go poking around in there. But the grandkids didn't listen. They were older now, and the curiosity was gnawing at them. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the grandkids stood at the edge of the property. They had been talking about Grandpa for hours, reminiscing about his life, his quirks, and his love for the farm. And then, without thinking, one of them spoke up. "We should go in the barn." At first there was silence. Everyone exchanged glances as if testing the waters to see if anyone else felt the same. They had all thought about it, but no one had ever said it out loud. It was a dangerous idea, a break from the rules that Grandpa had set. But now that he was gone, it felt like the right moment to finally find out what had been hidden all these years. One by one, they nodded in agreement. It was time. They were no longer children, and the barn was no longer just a place to be feared. It was a mystery, something that needed to be solved. They walked across the yard, the grass crunching beneath their feet as the evening air grew cooler. The barn, standing tall and weathered, seemed almost to be watching them. The barn doors were slightly ajar, just as they had always been. The wind made them creak, and for a moment the grandkids hesitated. It felt as though the barn was holding its breath, waiting for them to make a decision. And then, with a deep breath, one of them pushed the door open. The smell of old wood and dust hit them immediately, a musty scent that was both familiar and strange. They stepped inside cautiously, their hearts beating a little faster than usual. It was quiet in the barn, the only sound coming from the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the old tools that Grandpa had used for years sat in their places, just as they always had. But there was something different about it now. The barn didn't seem like the same place it had always been. It felt more like a secret waiting to be uncovered. They stood in the middle of the barn for a long moment, taking in the sight of it all. This was the first time any of them had ever stepped inside. Grandpa had always kept them at a distance, but now the barn felt strangely inviting. It wasn't just a barn anymore. It was a doorway to the past, to something that had been kept hidden from them for as long as they could remember. They were standing on the threshold of a mystery that had been locked away in their grandfather's heart for years. They didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. The discovery they were about to make would leave them speechless, forever altering the way they saw their grandfather, their family, and even themselves. And it all started with the barn. The door creaked as they pushed it open wider, stepping cautiously into the barn. The grandkids' hearts were racing, but they didn't speak. There was an unspoken understanding that this moment was different from all the others. This time they weren't children playing in the yard. They were adults, standing in the shadow of something they had never fully understood. They were about to discover something that had been hidden away for as long as they could remember. The air inside the barn was thick with dust. The smell of old wood and the faint trace of hay lingered in the corners. It felt like time had stood still here, like the barn had been frozen in a moment long before their grandfather had passed away. There was no warmth to the place, just a chill that seemed to settle around their shoulders. But still they moved forward, their eyes scanning every inch of the dimly lit room. They hadn't come this far to turn back. They stood at the entrance, taking it all in. The barn was cluttered with old farming tools, rusted hoes, faded buckets, broken shovels, and tattered sacks of grain. It looked like the kind of place where time had simply stopped, where things were left to age and rot, forgotten by everyone but Grandpa. In the back corner, there was a large wooden crate covered by a heavy tarp. The tarp was dusty like everything else in the barn, but it was too neatly placed, almost as if it had been arranged that way on purpose. One of them took a cautious step forward, and then another. The rest followed. No one spoke, though their steps were loud in the silence. They all knew that whatever was in the crate was the key to the mystery they'd been wondering about for years. As they reached the crate, one of them reached down to grab the corner of the tarp. The fabric was stiff and it resisted at first, but with a little effort it pulled free. The dust that had settled on it over the years billowed into the air, making them all cough and wave their hands to clear it away. Underneath the tarp, the crate was made of thick, sturdy wood. The edges were worn, but the craftsmanship was clear. It didn't look like the sort of box someone would casually leave behind. This was important, that much was clear. They exchanged looks, but none of them said anything. They were too close to the truth now. One of them knelt down to pry open the crate, using the edge of a rusty tool to gently lift the lid. The wood groaned in protest, but it eventually gave way. Inside there was a collection of old papers. The smell of old ink and leather filled the air as they slowly pulled the papers out. There were letters folded neatly, yellowed with age. Some were tied with string, others simply stacked together. There were also old photographs. Some were in black and white, others faded in sepia tones. They didn't recognize the faces in the photos, but they did recognize something else. The barn. In some of the pictures, the barn was a place of life, full of people they didn't know. There was even a picture of Grandpa, though he looked much younger in it. They spread the papers out on the barn floor, trying to make sense of them. There were dozens of letters, all from different times in their grandfather's life. Each letter seemed to tell a story, but it wasn't one they had ever heard. As they read through the letters, it became clear that Grandpa had led a life that no one had ever guessed at. A life filled with secrets, promises made to people they had never heard of. One of the letters was dated years before Grandpa had even married. The handwriting was elegant, flowing in a way that made it stand out from the others. It wasn't a letter to Grandma or to anyone in the family. It was addressed to someone they didn't recognize, someone named Eleanor. The letter was full of affection, of memories that were long past. It spoke of love, of a life they could only imagine, and then toward the end it took a darker turn. The letter ended with a promise, a heavy promise. I will make sure nothing comes between us. The world may change, but my feelings for you will never fade. I will see you again. I swear it. The grandkids looked at one another, confused and curious. This was not the Grandpa they knew. This wasn't the quiet man who had spent most of his days working the farm. Who was Eleanor? And why was this letter here, hidden away? The next letter they picked up was equally mysterious. It was written in a rushed, frantic hand, as though the writer was in a hurry, afraid to be caught. The tone was more urgent, and it spoke of a difficult decision, one that would change the course of everything. They read, I've made my choice, though I hate myself for it. I can never go back now. The farm will have to wait. I'm sorry, Eleanor, but there's no turning back. I'll never see you again. Please forget me for your own good. The grandkids stared at the letter, the words sinking in. What had Grandpa been involved in? Who was Eleanor? And what decision had Grandpa made that he felt so conflicted about? They continued to read through the letters, each one giving more pieces to the puzzle. Some were written in a more formal tone, others more personal. There were mentions of things the grandkids couldn't understand. Debts, deals made, people whose names they didn't know. But there was something more that stood out in every letter. A sense of regret, a feeling that their grandfather had been running from something. Running from people, from a life that was no longer his. As they flipped through the papers, one of them found a journal, bound in leather, its pages worn from use. The handwriting inside was different from the letters. It was less formal, more raw. The entries were written over the course of many years, and they revealed a side of Grandpa that none of them could have expected. The journal described events in Grandpa's life that had clearly been hidden from the family. There were mentions of arguments, of people he had wronged, and of relationships that had ended abruptly. There was even mention of a deal that had been struck many years ago, one that seemed to weigh heavily on Grandpa's conscience. I regret the choices I've made. The things I've done can never be undone. But I will keep my promise. I will protect them from the truth. They don't need to know what happened. They're better off without it. The words were haunting, like a secret that had been buried too deep to ever resurface. As they read further, they began to realize that Grandpa's life had been far more complicated than they had ever imagined. There were things he had done, choices he had made, that he had never shared with anyone. Even after all these years, he had kept his past hidden, hoping it would never come to light. The grandkids looked at each other, their minds racing. They had known that Grandpa was a man of few words, but they had never imagined this. They had never thought that the man who had raised them, who had taught them to work the land and to live simply, was hiding such a complex and troubled past. But what could they do now? What was there to do with all these letters, all these journals, and all this information? They were left with more questions than answers. It wasn't just the mystery of the barn anymore. It was the mystery of Grandpa himself. Who was he really? What had he been running from? Why had he kept this life hidden for so long? And most importantly, why hadn't he ever told them? As the grandkids sat in the barn surrounded by the papers and photos, they began to realize that the barn wasn't just a place of secrets. It was a place where Grandpa had tried to hide the past, bury it in hopes that no one would ever find it. But now the past was coming to light piece by piece. They didn't know it yet, but the discovery they had made would change everything. It would lead them down a path they never expected, and it would force them to confront the truth about their grandfather, and perhaps even about themselves. For now, though, they sat in silence, surrounded by the remnants of a life they didn't fully understand. The barn, once just a place of curiosity, had become a symbol of the mystery they were about to unravel, and there was no going back. The air in the barn felt heavier now, as if the weight of the secrets they had uncovered was pressing down on them. The grandkids sat scattered around the floor, papers and photos spread out in front of them, their minds racing with the questions that seemed to multiply with each new discovery. Grandpa's past was unraveling before their eyes, but instead of bringing clarity, it only seemed to deepen the mystery. They had already read through the letters and the journal entries several times, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. There were hints of a life that no one in the family had ever known about, a life full of choices that seemed to haunt Grandpa to the very end. But the more they read, the more they realized that the man they had loved and respected so deeply wasn't the same person who had written these words. There were stories in the journal that made their stomachs twist. Grandpa had written about a past filled with betrayals, lost opportunities, and decisions that he clearly regretted. There were references to people they didn't know, places they had never heard of, and events that seemed to be locked away in a part of Grandpa's life that he had tried to bury. But it wasn't just the past that was unsettling. It was the sense that their grandfather had been carrying something dark with him for all these years. The letters and journal entries revealed that there were people who wanted something from him, something that Grandpa had promised he would never give no matter the cost. And that promise, whatever it was, had shaped the man they had known all their lives. The grandkids sat in silence for a long time, each one lost in their own thoughts. They could feel the weight of the mystery, like an invisible force pulling at them. They had always thought of Grandpa as a quiet, private man, someone who kept to himself and rarely talked about the past. But now they realized that there had been so much more to him than they had ever imagined. "Do you think he ever meant for us to find this?" one of them finally asked, breaking the silence. The question hung in the air and no one immediately answered. It was a good question. Could it be that Grandpa had wanted them to know the truth all along, or had he hidden it away, hoping that no one would ever stumble upon the secrets he had kept for so long? "I don't think he wanted us to find it," another one said quietly. "He spent so much of his life trying to keep us away from the barn, from all of this. It's like he didn't want us to know who he really was." The others nodded in agreement. It seemed like Grandpa had done everything he could to protect them from the past. He had kept the barn locked up, kept his secrets hidden, and kept everyone at arm's length. It was clear now that there was a reason for that. A reason that had to do with guilt, shame, or perhaps something even darker. "Maybe he thought we wouldn't understand," one of them suggested. "Maybe he didn't want us to know how complicated things really were." The thought made sense. Grandpa had always been so simple in his ways. He had always worked hard, lived quietly, and kept his family close. He hadn't wanted anyone to worry about things that didn't concern them. But this was something else. The more they read, the more they realized how far removed they were from the man they thought they knew. He had lived a different life, one that was full of things they could never have imagined. They continued to sift through the papers, looking for more answers, more clues that might lead them to some understanding of what had happened. But as they read, they began to realize that the deeper they went, the less they understood. There was one letter that stood out among the others. It was shorter than the rest, but it was the one that seemed to make everything else feel more urgent. It was written in a hurried hand, and the words were stark, almost desperate. "It's too late. I can't undo what's been done. I can't go back now. They'll come for me, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. I've made my bed, and now I have to lie in it. I'll keep my promises, but it will cost me everything." They read it again and again, the words sinking in with a heaviness they hadn't expected. It was clear that Grandpa had been running from something, or someone, for a long time. There were mentions of threats of people who had been after him, and of promises that had been made that he could never break. But what was it that had been so dangerous? What had he done to put himself in such a position? The grandkids looked at each other, fear beginning to rise in their chests. They had thought that the letters and the journal entries would help them understand Grandpa better, but now they were left with more questions than answers. The further they dug, the more it seemed like they were uncovering something they weren't supposed to know. There was a nagging feeling in the pit of their stomachs, a sense that they were opening a door that had been closed for a reason. What if this was something better left buried? What if uncovering the truth would lead to more pain, more heartbreak than they were prepared to handle? But even as the doubt crept in, they couldn't stop themselves. They couldn't ignore the pull to understand. They had to know the truth. They had to understand why Grandpa had hidden all of this away. It wasn't just about the letters anymore. It was about Grandpa's life. A life they had never really known. A life that had been kept from them for reasons they still didn't fully understand. They had always believed that Grandpa was just a quiet, simple man, content with his farm and his family. But now they saw that he had been living in a kind of shadow, a man weighed down by choices he could never undo. As they continued to search through the barn, they found more photographs that showed Grandpa in places they didn't recognize. There were pictures of him in cities they had never heard of, standing with people they couldn't identify. In some of the photos, Grandpa was smiling, surrounded by others who looked happy and carefree. But in others, he looked different. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of quiet intensity, as if he was aware of something that no one else could see. The photographs made it clear that Grandpa's life had been far more complicated than anyone had realized. He had traveled, met people, and been involved in things that seemed to stretch beyond the farm, beyond the life they had known him for. And yet he had kept all of that hidden, locked away in this barn. As they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of Grandpa's past, it became clear that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than they had expected. They had uncovered pieces of a story, but the full story was still out of reach. And the more they learned, the more they realized that they might not be prepared for what they were about to discover. They didn't know it yet, but the truth was much darker, much more complicated than they could have imagined. And the secrets they were uncovering were only the beginning. The barn, once a place of curiosity, had become the gateway to a mystery that would change everything they thought they knew about their grandfather and about themselves. As the grandkids continued to sift through the contents of the crate, the realization began to set in that their journey had only just begun. The barn, which had once seemed like an old, quiet place of forgotten memories, had turned into a window into their grandfather's past. A past filled with unanswered questions, promises made in the shadows, and a life that none of them had ever imagined. The more they uncovered, the more they understood that Grandpa wasn't the simple, hard-working man they had always believed him to be. He had been involved in something much bigger, something hidden behind layers of time and secrecy. They had only scratched the surface, but what they had found so far felt like a tangled web of stories that didn't quite fit together. Every letter, every photo, every journal entry raised more questions than answers. It had been hours since they'd first started reading the letters, but none of them had moved. The barn, which had once felt like an ordinary part of the farm, now felt heavy, like it was pressing down on them with all the weight of Grandpa's secrets. The grandkids sat in a semicircle around the crate, papers and photographs scattered at their feet, their minds spinning as they tried to piece everything together. One of them flipped through another old photograph they had found. This one was particularly striking. It showed Grandpa standing beside a group of men, all wearing dark suits. There was something about the way the men were arranged in the picture that made it feel more like a gathering of people who knew something dangerous was afoot, rather than a simple group of friends or colleagues. Grandpa stood at the center, his expression serious, his hands gripping the shoulders of the person beside him as if to steady himself. "What is this?" one of them whispered, barely able to take in the image. Who were these people? There was no answer to the question, but they all felt the same unease. This wasn't the picture of Grandpa they had grown up with. This wasn't the kindly man who had shown them how to milk cows and fix fences. The man in this photo seemed like someone else altogether, someone who had been a part of something far larger, something that demanded loyalty, silence, and perhaps even a price that Grandpa had paid. They continued flipping through the papers, but this time their eyes were searching for something specific. They were no longer just reading the letters and journals. They were looking for a connection, a clue that would explain what had happened all those years ago. What had Grandpa been involved in? And why had he gone to such great lengths to keep them from finding out? Then one of them found it, a letter that was unlike the others. It was older, the paper fragile and yellowed with age. The ink had started to fade, but the words were still legible. It was a letter from someone named Thomas, and as they read through it, the name seemed to echo through the barn, like a ghost calling out from the past. The letter was short, but it carried a sense of urgency that none of the others had. It was clear that Thomas was trying to communicate something important, something that needed to be said even if it was too late. The letter read, "I don't know how long I can keep this hidden, but I won't let them silence me. You need to know the truth before it's too late. I know you promised to protect them, but you can't run from this forever. It's too big. They're coming for all of us." The grandkids looked at each other, their hearts racing. Who was Thomas? And why was he warning Grandpa? What was too big, and who were they? One of them, their voice trembling, asked, "Do you think Grandpa knew he was in danger?" The question hung in the air, but it felt like the most important one yet. If Grandpa had been part of something so dangerous, then maybe that explained why he had kept so many things hidden. It wasn't just about protecting the family from the past. It was about keeping them safe from something more immediate, something that had been after him for years. As they sat there trying to make sense of the letter, they noticed something strange. At the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, there was a set of coordinates written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. They weren't familiar with the numbers at first, but when they looked at them closely, something clicked. The coordinates pointed to a location not far from the farm, just a few miles away, tucked into the hills that surrounded the property. "Why would Thomas leave this?" one of them asked, looking at the rest of them. "What is this place?" They didn't have an answer. But the fact that the coordinates were tied to Grandpa's past, and the fact that Thomas had felt the need to write them down, felt like a sign that there was something out there, something that connected everything they had discovered so far. They decided to go to the location. There was no turning back now. They had already uncovered too much to ignore the signs that something bigger was at play. Whatever it was, they needed to know what it had to do with Grandpa, and what it had to do with them. It was late in the afternoon by the time they piled into their cars and headed out. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The air had turned cooler, and the wind whispered through the trees, as if the world itself was waiting for them to discover the truth. The drive was short, but it felt like an eternity. The tension in the car was thick and the silence was deafening. They all knew that something was about to change. The farm had always been a place of safety, of comfort, but now it felt different, like they were stepping into a chapter of their family's story that had been hidden for too long. As they neared the location marked by the coordinates, they noticed that the landscape began to change. The winding road they had been driving on turned into a narrow dirt path, surrounded by dense trees and overgrown brush. It was clear that no one had come this way in a long time. The car slowed as they approached a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a small weathered cabin, its wooden walls cracked and faded by years of exposure to the elements. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but there was something about the cabin that made the grandkids feel uneasy. It was too quiet here, too still. It felt like a place where secrets had been buried, where something had been hidden from the world. They parked the car a few yards away and stepped out into the cool evening air. The cabin loomed ahead, its shadow stretching long in the fading light. As they approached, one of them hesitated, feeling an unsettling chill crawl up their spine. There was no turning back now. They reached the door and found that it was slightly ajar. No one had locked it, and it seemed like the cabin had been waiting for them, as though it had known they would come. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a dark interior. Inside, the air was thick with dust. There were old, rusted tools scattered across the floor, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like forgotten memories. But in the far corner of the cabin, something caught their eye. It was a wooden chest, old and weathered, but it was the only thing in the room that seemed out of place. It was too carefully placed, too intentional. Without a word, they approached the chest. The grandkids' hearts were pounding in their chests as they knelt down to open it. It was heavy, the lid resisting at first, but with a collective effort they managed to pry it open. Inside the chest were more papers, more letters, and strangely, several old photographs. The photos were black and white, but they were different from the ones in the barn. These were of people none of them recognized. In each photo, Grandpa was there, standing among them, his face serious and tense. The people around him looked like soldiers, like they had come from another time altogether. One of the grandkids reached for a letter that was folded neatly inside. It was sealed with wax and it looked ancient. As they broke the seal and unfolded the letter, they read the words in silence. The past cannot be undone, but the future must be protected. You have made your choice and there is no turning back. Watch the hills. They will come for you. The room felt colder and the weight of the letter seemed to press on their shoulders. There was no doubt now. Whatever their grandfather had been involved in, it wasn't something that could be ignored. It was something they needed to understand and something they needed to confront before it was too late. The grandkids stood in the doorway of the old cabin, their eyes scanning the contents of the chest they had just opened. The air was thick with dust and the silence felt heavier now, like something was pressing down on them from all sides. They had come looking for answers and now they had found more than they had ever expected. The letter they had just read was still clutched in one of their hands. The words echoed in their minds, each syllable searing into their thoughts. The past cannot be undone, but the future must be protected. You have made your choice and there is no turning back. Watch the hills. They will come for you. Who had written this? What did it mean? The grandkids exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the letter now settling like a heavy fog over them. They had already uncovered so many secrets about Grandpa's past, but this felt different. This felt like a warning, and the mention of the hills made them uneasy. The hills surrounded their farm. They had always been a familiar, comforting presence, but now they felt like a looming threat. The chest was full of other things, more photographs, more letters, and even some old maps. But it was the letter that had shaken them to the core. They needed to understand what it meant. They needed to know what was really going on, because everything they had uncovered up until now pointed to something much bigger than they had realized. Without saying a word, they began gathering the papers and photographs, carefully placing them back in the chest. The pictures of Grandpa with strange people, the letters with cryptic messages, everything felt connected. But connected to what? The question was gnawing at them and they had no answers. Not yet. They looked around the cabin one last time before leaving. The place felt abandoned, yet it felt as though it had been waiting for them, as though someone had expected them to come. It was a feeling that was impossible to shake. They turned and made their way back to the cars, their minds racing with all the new questions they now had. The drive back to the farm was quiet. The grandkids sat in their own thoughts, processing everything they had just seen. The letter, the chest, the photographs, they all pointed to something, but they weren't sure what. They needed to figure this out. They couldn't let it go. Grandpa had left them with these clues, and now it was up to them to make sense of it all. When they returned to the farm, they gathered in the kitchen, the central place where so many important family discussions had taken place over the years. The table was cluttered with papers and photographs, and for the first time, the grandkids could see how deeply this mystery had affected them all. They weren't just dealing with the past anymore. They were dealing with something that seemed to reach into their present, and perhaps even their future. "I think we need to go back to the hills," one of them said, breaking the silence. The others looked at her, their faces pale. "I know it sounds crazy, but the letter mentioned them. It mentioned watching the hills. Grandpa knew something, and whatever it was, it's still out there." They all knew she was right. The hills were part of the landscape they had grown up in. They were always there, just beyond the farm. But now, they had become more than just a backdrop to their lives. They had become part of a puzzle they couldn't ignore. "I agree," another one said. "We need to understand what Grandpa was protecting us from. Maybe the answer is up there in the hills. Maybe we'll find something that makes sense of all this." The decision was made. They would return to the hills. They couldn't let this mystery slip away. They couldn't live with the uncertainty that hung over them. Whatever Grandpa had been trying to protect them from, they had to face it. They had no choice. They gathered their things, grabbed flashlights, and made their way out of the house once more. The sun had set and the night was cool and still. The sound of crickets filled the air as they walked toward the hills, the shadows of the trees stretching out in front of them like fingers reaching toward the sky. The path was familiar to them, but tonight, it felt different. It felt as though the hills themselves were watching waiting for them to come closer. With each step they took, the air grew colder, and the tension in their chests grew tighter. This wasn't just a walk through familiar territory. This was a journey into the unknown. As they ascended the hill, the silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel. They reached the top and paused, looking out at the land below them. The farm, their home, was visible in the distance, bathed in the pale light of the moon. But there was something about the view that felt different tonight. It felt as though they were looking at it through a veil, like they were seeing it for the first time but with new eyes. "This is it," one of them said quietly. "The hills. The letter said we had to watch them. What are we supposed to find here?" They looked around, scanning the area for anything unusual. The landscape was dotted with trees and boulders, but nothing seemed out of place. It was just a quiet hilltop, like so many others around the farm. But then something caught their eye. Near the base of one of the larger trees there was an old weathered stone. It was covered in moss, almost hidden from view, but the way it sat there, almost like it had been placed deliberately, made them uneasy. "Do you think this is it?" one of them asked. There was a strange feeling in the air, something unexplainable. The stone looked like it had been there for ages, but there was something new about it. Something that felt wrong. They approached the stone carefully, their steps slow and deliberate. As they got closer, they noticed that there were strange markings etched into the surface. They were faded and hard to make out, but they definitely looked like symbols. Symbols that didn't belong to any language they recognized. One of them knelt down to examine it more closely, running their fingers over the markings. "What is this?" they murmured, tracing the lines with care. The symbols seemed to glow faintly under their touch, as if they had been waiting for someone to discover them. "I don't know," another one said, "but it feels like we're getting closer. Whatever Grandpa was trying to keep us from, it's here. This stone, these markings, this is part of it." The others nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. It was as if they had crossed some kind of threshold, stepping into a world that had been hidden from them all their lives. Whatever this was, it was real. It was part of Grandpa's life, and it was part of their story now, too. "We need to take this back to the barn," one of them said. "Maybe these markings will make sense once we look at them with everything else we've found. We can't just leave this here." They carefully examined the stone one last time, then made their way back down the hill,